Okay, so I'm continuing the build of my Team Associated TC7 touring car kit, and I thought I'd take you through some of the things I do with the chassis and show you the different options on the steering. Okay, so with this kit you can run the steering in a few different layouts. You can have it mounted on the chassis as per the kit, or you can run it in a floating steering, so the steering bell cranks float off the chassis and give extra flex. Okay, so in the kit you get the servo bracket at the top here, the servo mount. That's used for both options, for mounting it to the chassis or mounting it floating. If you want to run the floating, the only extra options you need to buy is you need to get the post, the floating steering post, which is shorter and has a different offset than the one that goes on the chassis. Now I've seen a few people get confused putting this together. So basically, as the kit, the steering bell crank is mounted like this, so it goes onto the post with the thick part at the bottom and the arm at the top. Now when you change it over for the floating steering, so you put the shorter post in the top, you need to flip this part as well, because this is going to mount to the top then, so then you need the thick part and the arm at the bottom, so the arm actually stays in the same place. It just means that, as I've got it on this car, it's floating from the top, so it's hanging from the top, floating off the chassis, which basically means it's only mounted to the chassis at the servo mount. So you get more flex at the front of the car, which can make the front roll more, give a feeling of more steering. You need to try it track to track, it's always different. But it's worth trying the two different options, so mounting it as per the kit to the chassis, or trying it with floating off the top bracket. Okay, so staying on the steering, the steering link which goes from the centre of the steering crank to the servo, it's pretty much on the maximum of its articulation of the ball. So I've seen some people say about raising this ball, but I prefer to leave it as low as it can be, because the angle's actually quite good. The angle smooths out the steering, it gives you like an exponential feel. So I've actually found that having it quite a steep angle is actually better. So what I do is I just take a knife and just basically just take the corner off of the ball. If you can see it, all I've done is just basically slice down the corner. So you don't want to go more than halfway through, because you'll lose the grip of the ball. But you just sort of take that corner off, and then when you put that on the centre ball, you get more of an angle. So at the steeper angle, it doesn't bind in the middle. But just make sure you haven't taken too much off and it still pops on nice and tight, because obviously you don't want that coming off. Okay, now on the battery layout, if you saw one of my videos from the 6.2, you'll see I did this on the 6.2. So I basically take two extra servo posts, they're the ones that normally go on this side here of the servo, and just using washers and countersink washers, you can space your battery in and out, because obviously the batteries, you know, they all weigh different amounts. So if you're going to run like an 8000, you know, they weigh about 330 grams, where if you're going to run sort of the 5600, you're down at sort of 270. So, you know, there's 60 odd grams difference in the battery weight. That's going to massively change the weight distribution left to right. So to check that it weighs the same, basically a lighter battery will want to be spaced further out, and a heavier battery will be further in towards the belt. So to achieve this, on the battery straps, I just cut the outer part off, which restricts the amount that you can move the battery. So I just have it that it's just the inner part basically. So, and then all I use is these shims basically to move the battery in and out for where I want it to get the balance right, if I'm running stock or modified, you know, where I want to put the battery, what type of battery I'm using. Okay, just going back to the steering again. Again, you might have seen this on the 6.2 video, but depending on what servo you use, you might want to space the top plate up, put a couple of shims between the plate, the graphite plate, and the blue mount, because basically all the servos vary in size. I've got a couple here. If I grab the verniers. So this is a KO servo, and if you measure the depth of it, it's 21.1. This is a Savox servo, and it's 20, just under 20.2, so there's almost a millimetre difference in depth. So obviously if Associated made this mount too high, then if you were using a thin servo, the servo is going to be too far off the chassis, and obviously the weight's going to be higher than it needs. So they sort of have to pick a point. Well, that should do for most servos. So basically, I found if you're using the KO servo, you need to sort of put about 1/2 mil between the blue mount and the carbon, just so that the servo's off the ground. I mean, the idea of a floating servo mount is that the servo's meant to float. So you don't want it too high, because you don't want the weight higher than it needs to be, but, you know, sort of 1/2 mil, 1/4 mil underneath the servo, between the servo and the chassis, so you get the flex without it binding on the servo. That's the whole point of it. So just make sure you check that, and, you know, check that the servo you're using is the right thickness and it's floating off the chassis, and add some shims if needed. Okay, thanks. I shall be back with some more later.